Tears streamed down Maggie Sullivan's face as she stared at the broken fence posts strewn across the dusty ground, the final blow to a day that had already stolen everything from her. Colorado Territory, 1875, was proving to be a cruel and unforgiving place for a woman alone. The crisp autumn air bit at her cheeks as Maggie sank to her knees beside the trampled fence line that once marked the boundary of her small homestead. Cattle had broken through during the night, destroying her vegetable garden, the last hope she had of making it through the coming winter. With her husband Thomas 6 months in the grave and the bank threatening foreclosure, the ruined garden felt like the final nail in the coffin of her dreams. She pressed her hand against her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that shook her slender frame. At 22, Maggie had never imagined being a widow, let alone facing the prospect of losing everything she and Thomas had worked for over the past 3 years. Her honey-brown hair tumbled loose from its pins as she bent her head, shoulders trembling beneath her faded calico dress. "Madam." "You all right there?" The deep voice startled her, and Maggie scrambled to her feet, hastily wiping her tears with her apron. A tall figure on horseback had stopped on the dirt road that ran alongside her property. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, revealing a man in his early 30s with sun-weathered skin and piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. "I'm fine," Maggie said automatically, her voice betraying her with a slight quaver. "Just a bit of trouble with the fence is all." The man's gaze swept over the broken posts and trampled garden beyond. Understanding dawned in those blue eyes. "Looks like someone's cattle paid you an unwelcome visit." "The Henderson herd," Maggie confirmed, a flash of anger momentarily overriding her despair. "Third time this month, but never this bad before." The stranger nodded, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with hints of gold from long days under the sun. "Name's Xavier Reed. Most folks call me Zav. I'm foreman at the Circle P just north of here." "Maggie Sullivan," she replied, suddenly conscious of her tear-stained face and disheveled appearance. "This was the Sullivan homestead." Xavier's eyes lingered on the small cabin behind her, the modest barn, and finally returned to the broken fence. Without another word, he walked along the fence line, examining the damage with the critical eye of someone who knew his way around ranch work. "Henderson's been letting his fences go to ruin, and his cattle wander where they please for years," Xavier said, his voice tight with disapproval. "Man's too cheap to hire enough hands to keep things proper." Maggie wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. "Doesn't much matter now. The bank's coming for the place end of the month anyway." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Your husband around, Mrs. Sullivan, widowed," she said simply. 6 months now. Fever took him quick." Something softened in Xavier's eyes. He looked back at the fence, then to his horse waiting patiently on the road, and seemed to make a decision. "I've got some time before I'm expected back," he said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal strong tanned forearms. "Let me see what I can do about this fence." "I can't pay you," Maggie said quickly. Xavier shook his head. "Not asking for payment just seems the right thing to do." Before she could protest further, he was striding toward his horse. He returned moments later with a set of tools from his saddlebags and set to work, pulling the broken posts free and assessing what could be salvaged. Maggie stood uncertainly for a moment before her practical nature took over. "I'll fetch some water," she offered. By midday, Xavier had repaired the worst of the damage, sweat darkening his blue cotton shirt despite the cool autumn air. Maggie brought him water and eventually some bread and dried apple slices, the last of her stores, though she didn't mention this fact. As they sat in the shade of her lone oak tree, Xavier wiped his brow with a bandana. "Mrs. Sullivan, If you don't mind my asking, what are your plans when the bank takes the property? Maggie stared at her rough hands, calloused from work Thomas had never intended her to do alone. My sister's in Denver. She's offered me a place, but… She trailed off, unwilling to voice her dread of city life and the thought of being dependent on her sister's husband's charity. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. The Circle P tickets looking for a cook. Owner's wife used to handle it, but she's expecting their third child and the doctors ordered her to rest. He glanced at Maggie. Pays fair, includes room and board. Owner's a good man, treats his people right. Maggie blinked in surprise. You're offering me a job. If you can cook, Xavier said with the hint of a smile. Can you? Yes, Maggie replied, thinking of the countless meals she'd prepared for Thomas and the occasional dinner they'd hosted for neighboring homesteaders. But I've never cooked for a ranch before. Same principle, just more mouths, Xavier said, rising to his feet. Think about it. I'll be heading back this way day after tomorrow. Could give you a ride to the ranch if you're interested. Hope flickered in Maggie's chest for the first time in months. A job, honest work that would keep a roof over her head and food in her belly. It wasn't what she and Thomas had dreamed of, but it was something. I'll think on it, she promised. Xavier nodded, returning to the fence. By late afternoon, he had the damaged section mended well enough to keep wandering cattle at bay. As he gathered his tools, Maggie approached with a small cloth-wrapped package. Some cornbread, she explained. It's not much, but it's more than enough, Xavier interrupted gently, accepting the humble offering. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. Maggie, she corrected him. Just Maggie. Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that made Maggie's cheeks warm. Xavier tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and with a final nod, rode away. That night, as Maggie lay in her lonely bed, she thought about Xavier Reed's unexpected kindness and his job offer. The thought of leaving the homestead brought a pang of grief. This place held all her memories of Thomas, but staying wasn't an option. Perhaps this was the lifeline she needed. 2 days later, Maggie stood beside the repaired fence, a single trunk containing her belongings at her feet. She'd spent the previous day harvesting what remained of her garden and packing the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind. The rest she'd sold to a neighboring family for a pittance, but it was enough to pay the most pressing of her debts. When Xavier appeared on the horizon, leading a wagon rather than riding his horse, Maggie felt a curious flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with anxiety about her decision. You decided to take the job? Xavier asked as he pulled the wagon to a stop. Maggie nodded. If the offer still stands. Xavier's smile transformed his serious face. It does. Mr. Parker will be pleased, his wife even more so. The journey to the Circle P took most of the day, giving Maggie time to study her companion. Xavier wasn't a talkative man, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and often unexpectedly kind. He pointed out landmarks, told her about the ranch and the people she'd meet there, and asked questions about her life before Colorado that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. By the time they arrived at the sprawling ranch, with its impressive main house and cluster of outbuildings, Maggie felt more at ease with Xavier than she had with anyone since Thomas's death. Mrs. Parker, a petite blonde woman whose pregnancy was clearly advanced, welcomed Maggie warmly. Mr. Reed said you might be joining us. I can't tell you how grateful I am. The doctor says I'm to stay off my feet as much as possible, and with 20 ranch hands to feed, that's no small order. I'm happy to help, Maggie said sincerely, and grateful for the opportunity. Xavier will show you to the cook's quarters, Mrs. Parker said. It's not grand, but it's private and comfortable. We take our meals together in the main house, myself, Mr. Parker, our children, and Xavier as foreman. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. You'll have a kitchen girl to help with the heavy work. Xavier carried Maggie's trunk to a small but tidy cabin a short distance from the main house. It was indeed modest, a single room with a bed, chest of drawers, small table, and 2 chairs, but after months of worrying about losing her home entirely, it felt like a palace. "Kitchen's there," Xavier said, pointing to a large outbuilding between the main house and the bunkhouse. "Breakfast for the hands is at sunrise, dinner at noon, supper at sundown. Family eats an hour after the hands at each meal." Maggie nodded, taking in the information. "I'll be ready." Xavier hesitated at the door. "The Parkers are good people. You'll be treated fairly here." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm glad you came." Before Maggie could respond, he was gone, striding toward the corral where several men were breaking a spirited Mustang. The first weeks at the Circle P passed in a blur of hard work and adjustment. Maggie rose before dawn each day to start breakfast, worked through the day preparing meals, baking bread, and preserving foods for the winter ahead, and fell into bed each night exhausted but satisfied. Mrs. Parker Elizabeth, as she insisted Maggie call her, often kept her company in the kitchen when her health permitted, sharing recipes and stories. Through her, Maggie learned more about Xavier Reed. "He's been with the ranch for 8 years now," Elizabeth told her one afternoon as they shelled peas. "Started as a regular hand but worked his way up. My husband says he's the best foreman the Circle P has ever had. The men respect him and he's fair but firm." "He seems very dedicated," Maggie observed, trying to sound casual. Elizabeth smiled knowingly. "He is, perhaps too dedicated. All work and no play. My husband tries to convince him to attend the socials in town, but he rarely goes." "He has no family?" Maggie asked before she could stop herself. Elizabeth's face grew somber. "None living. Lost his parents young and his brother died in the war. Had a sweetheart once, I believe, but something happened there. He doesn't speak of it." Maggie nodded, filing away this information. It explained the shadow she sometimes glimpsed in Xavier's eyes, a shadow she recognized from her own reflection. Their interactions were limited but consistent. Xavier always thanked her for meals, occasionally commented on a particularly good dish, and sometimes lingered after the family had finished eating to exchange a few words about the day. Maggie found herself looking forward to these brief conversations, though she tried not to examine that feeling too closely. One evening in late October, Maggie was returning from the henhouse with a basket of eggs when she heard the unmistakable sound of a guitar drifting from the direction of the stables. Curious, she followed the music to find Xavier seated on a hay bale, his long fingers moving skillfully over the strings as he played a melancholy tune. He looked up at her approach, his hands stilling. "Evening, Maggie. I didn't know you played," she said, setting her basket down. Xavier shrugged. "Not often anymore, mostly when I've got things on my mind." "Don't stop on my account," Maggie said. "It's beautiful." After a moment's hesitation, Xavier resumed playing, the notes hanging in the air between them like a conversation neither knew how to start. Maggie sat on another hay bale, closing her eyes to better absorb the music. When the song ended, she opened her eyes to find Xavier watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My husband used to sing," she said softly. "Not well, mind you, but with great enthusiasm." "I miss that music in the house," Xavier nodded. "Music has a way of filling empty spaces." The simple observation struck Maggie as profoundly true. "Yes, it does." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments before Xavier spoke again. "The first snow will come soon. Mr. Parker mentioned you might need warmer clothes for the winter. There's a seamstress in town who's reasonable." "Mrs. Parker has already been generous with hand-me-downs," Maggie said, "but thank you for the concern." Xavier set his guitar aside. "I'm heading into town tomorrow for supplies. You're welcome to come along if you need anything." Maggie considered the offer. She hadn't left the ranch since her arrival, and the thought of a change of scenery was appealing. "I would like that, thank you." The next day they set out in the wagon shortly after breakfast. The ride to town took nearly 2 hours, but the conversation flowed more easily than Maggie expected. Xavier told her about his years working cattle drives before settling at the Circle P, and Maggie shared stories of her childhood in Illinois and the journey west with Thomas after their marriage. "What made you decide to homestead?" Xavier asked as the wagon rumbled along the rutted road. Maggie smiled at the memory. "Thomas had such dreams. He'd read about the Homestead Act and couldn't stop talking about building something that was truly ours. He was a dreamer, my Thomas." "And you?" Xavier glanced at her. "Were you a dreamer too?" The question gave Maggie pause. "I suppose I was more practical, but I loved his dreams enough to make them mine." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "It takes both kinds to make something last, dreamers and those with feet planted firmly on the ground." In town, Xavier had business at the general store, the blacksmith, and the bank. Maggie purchased thread, needles, and fabric for a new winter dress, using a small portion of her first month's wages. As they were loading their purchases into the wagon, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A man was shouting obscenities at a young woman who was trying to escape his grasp. No one seemed inclined to intervene until Xavier handed Maggie the reins and strode purposefully toward the disturbance. "That's enough, Henderson," Xavier said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet street. Maggie's heart leapt to her throat. Henderson, the same man whose cattle had destroyed her garden. She watched as Xavier calmly positioned himself between Henderson and the frightened woman. "This ain't your business, Reed," Henderson snarled, his words slurred from drink despite the early hour. "When you're manhandling a lady in the middle of the street, it becomes everyone's business," Xavier replied evenly. Henderson lunged forward, but Xavier sidestepped him easily. When Henderson stumbled and turned, Xavier caught his arm and twisted it behind his back in one smooth motion, forcing the drunken man to his knees. "I suggest you go sleep it off," Xavier said quietly. "Unless you'd prefer the sheriff to provide accommodation." Henderson cursed but nodded. Xavier released him and helped the young woman to her feet. After ensuring she was unharmed and sending her on her way with a respectful tip of his hat, he returned to the wagon. "Sorry about that," he said to Maggie, taking the reins back. "Don't be," Maggie replied, studying him with new appreciation. "That was Henderson, the same one whose cattle broke my fence," Xavier nodded grimly. "One and the same. Man's been a menace to this county for years. Drinks too much, treats his workers poorly, and lets his stock run wild over other people's land." "Thank you," Maggie said suddenly. "For fixing my fence that day, I never properly thanked you." Xavier's expression softened. "No thanks needed. Like I said, it was the right thing to do." As they rode back to the ranch, Maggie found herself sneaking glances at Xavier's profile. There was more to this quiet, serious man than she had initially realized, and she couldn't deny the growing warmth she felt in his presence. November brought the first heavy snowfall, transforming the ranch into a winter wonderland that was beautiful but treacherous. The ranch hands worked tirelessly to ensure the cattle had access to feed and water, often returning to the bunkhouse with ice in their beards and exhaustion in their eyes. Maggie responded by making heartier meals, thick stews, fresh bread, and hot coffee always at the ready. She took to bringing Xavier a cup of coffee in the stables when he returned from particularly long days, a small gesture that evolved into a ritual neither acknowledged but both anticipated. One evening, as they sat on upturned crates in the relative warmth of the stables, Xavier asked, "Do you miss it? Your homestead?" Maggie cradled her own cup of coffee, considering the question. "I miss what it represented the future Thomas and I planned, but honestly the work was crushing me. I was barely surviving each day." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. Some dreams need more than one pair of hands to build. "Yes," Maggie agreed softly. "I see that now." They fell silent, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the distant howl of a coyote. "Christmas is coming," Xavier said eventually. "The Parkers make quite a celebration of it. The whole ranch gathers in the main house for dinner on Christmas Eve." "Elizabeth mentioned it," Maggie said. "I've been planning the menu with her. It will be my first Christmas without Thomas." Xavier's gaze met hers. "The first one is the hardest, but it helps to be among people who care." Something in his tone made Maggie wonder who had helped him through his first Christmas alone. Before she could find a way to ask, a ranch hand burst into the stables. "Zav, one of the pregnant heifers is down in the north pasture. Looks like early labor, and she's struggling." Xavier was on his feet immediately. "Get Miller and Johnson, tell them to bring the medical kit and ropes." He turned to Maggie. "Sorry to cut this short." "Go," she urged. "I'll have hot food waiting when you return." The heifer and her calf both survived, thanks to Xavier's quick action and experience. When he finally returned to the main house well after midnight, Maggie was waiting with a plate of food kept warm by the stove and a fresh pot of coffee. "You didn't have to wait up," Xavier said, though gratitude shone in his tired eyes. "I wanted to," Maggie replied simply. As December progressed, Maggie found herself drawn more and more to Xavier's quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. She told herself it was natural to seek friendship in a new place, but deep down, she recognized the stirrings of something deeper and the guilt that accompanied those feelings. Thomas had been gone less than a year. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man so soon? Would Thomas understand, or would he feel betrayed? These questions plagued her as she prepared for the Christmas celebrations. The day before Christmas Eve, a blizzard descended on the ranch, confining everyone to their quarters. Maggie had just stoked the fire in her cabin when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Xavier, snow dusting his coat and hat, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth under his arm. "Xavier, come in before you freeze," she exclaimed, stepping aside. He stamped the snow from his boots and entered, bringing a gust of cold air with him. "Sorry to disturb you. I wanted to make sure you had enough firewood to last the night. This storm's turning nasty." "I'm well supplied, thank you," Maggie said, gesturing to the stack of wood beside the hearth. Xavier nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, then held out the bundle. "I also brought you something, an early Christmas gift, I suppose." Surprised and touched, Maggie accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a beautiful wooden box with intricate carvings of wildflowers on the lid. "Xavier," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you make this?" He nodded, a rare flush coloring his cheekbones. "Noticed you keep your sewing things in that old tin. Thought you might like something better." Maggie opened the box to find compartments perfectly sized for thread, needles, buttons, and other sewing notions. "It's beautiful, thank you." "Merry Christmas, Maggie," Xavier said softly. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for weeks. For a breathless moment, Maggie thought he might step closer, might even kiss her, but Xavier cleared his throat and moved toward the door. "I should let you get some rest. Big day tomorrow with the Christmas Eve feast." "Wait," Maggie said, setting the box carefully on her table. "I have something for you, too." She retrieved a package from her dresser drawer and handed it to him. Xavier unwrapped it to reveal a knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "You made this?" he asked, running the soft fabric through his fingers. Maggie nodded, suddenly shy. "I noticed your old one was rather threadbare." Xavier wrapped the scarf around his neck, his expression tender. "No one's made me anything in a very long time. Thank you, Maggie." This time, the silence between them was charged with unspoken words. Xavier took a half step toward her, then seemed to think better of it. "Good night, Maggie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay warm." After he left, Maggie sat by the fire, her fingers tracing the carvings on the wooden box. The care and time Xavier had put into the gift spoke volumes. She thought of Thomas, then not with the sharp pain that had accompanied his memory for months, but with a gentler ache, like an old wound finally beginning to heal. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room. "I always will, but I think you'd want me to be happy." Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the blizzard having blown itself out overnight. The ranch was transformed into a pristine white landscape that glittered in the winter sunshine. Maggie spent the day in the kitchen with Elizabeth and 2 kitchen girls, preparing the feast that would feed the entire ranch. By evening, the main house was filled with warmth, light, and the delicious aromas of roasted meats, fresh bread, and spiced desserts. The ranch hands, scrubbed clean and in their Sunday best, filed in with an almost comical formality that quickly gave way to boisterous camaraderie, as Mr. Parker served generous portions of his prized whiskey. Maggie, wearing her new dress of deep green wool, found herself the recipient of many compliments and thanks for the magnificent meal. She accepted them graciously, her eyes frequently seeking out Xavier, who stood tall and handsome in a clean white shirt and dark vest at the far end of the room. When the eating was done and the singing began, Xavier made his way to her side, a glass of whiskey in each hand. He offered one to Maggie, who accepted it with a smile. "Quite a feast," he said, his eyes warm as they took in her appearance. "You've outdone yourself." "Thank you," Maggie replied. "Everyone seems to be enjoying themselves. Including you, I hope?" Xavier's gaze was intent. Maggie nodded. "Very much. It's good to be part of something like this again." The evening progressed with songs, stories, and even dancing when one of the hands produced a fiddle. Maggie found herself swept into a lively reel, passed from partner to partner until she landed breathlessly in Xavier's arms for the final measures. His hand at her waist was strong and sure, his steps confident as he guided her through the dance. When the music ended, he didn't immediately release her, and Maggie found she didn't want him to. "Would you care for some air?" Xavier asked quietly. "It's gotten rather warm in here." Maggie nodded, and they slipped outside onto the porch. The night was crystal clear, stars blazing overhead in a black velvet sky. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. "Beautiful night," Maggie said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Xavier moved closer, his warmth a shield against the cold. "Beautiful indeed." There was no mistaking his meaning as his gaze rested on her face. Maggie felt a blush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the whiskey. "Maggie," Xavier began, his voice serious, "I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband. I know you're still grieving, and I would never want to disrespect that grief or his memory." Maggie's heart began to race. "But," she prompted softly, "but I find myself thinking about you constantly," Xavier continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your strength, your kindness, your quiet grace in the face of hardship. I've never met anyone like you." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just wanted you to know that if you ever feel ready to consider a future that includes someone new. I would very much like to be that someone. Tears pricked at Maggie's eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming tenderness of the moment. Xavier, the door burst open, spilling light and noise onto the porch as several ranch hands tumbled out, laughing and shoving one another good-naturedly. The intimate moment shattered, Xavier stepped back, his expression closing like a book snapped shut. "We should go back inside," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It's too cold out here." Maggie wanted to protest, to recapture the moment, but the opportunity was lost. For the remainder of the evening, Xavier kept a polite distance, and Maggie was left wondering what she would have said if they hadn't been interrupted. The days following Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. A Chinook wind melted much of the snow, creating treacherous mud that made ranch work doubly difficult. Xavier was constantly busy with the cattle, often leaving before dawn and returning well after dark, while Maggie's duties in the kitchen kept her equally occupied. Their brief encounters were cordial but guarded, as if both were uncertain how to proceed after their interrupted conversation on Christmas Eve. Maggie found herself replaying Xavier's words in her mind, examining her own feelings with growing clarity. The truth was, she was falling in love with Xavier Reed. The realization didn't bring the guilt she had expected, but rather a sense of rightness, as if her heart had been quietly waiting for her mind to catch up. New Year's Eve arrived, bringing with it another celebration, though more subdued than Christmas. As midnight approached, Maggie found herself once again on the porch of the main house, seeking a moment of quiet reflection. The sound of boots on the wooden steps alerted her to Xavier's presence before he spoke. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his breath visible in the cold night air. Maggie smiled and shook her head. "Not at all." Xavier leaned against the porch railing beside her, his gaze fixed on the distant mountain silvered by moonlight. "Another year ending. Time passes quickly. And slowly, sometimes," Maggie added. "This past year has felt like both endless in grief but gone in the blink of an eye." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. Loss has a way of distorting time. They stood in silence for a moment before Maggie gathered her courage. "Xavier, about what you said on Christmas Eve, you don't need to say anything," Xavier interrupted gently. "I shouldn't have spoken so soon." "It wasn't fair to you." "No," Maggie said firmly, turning to face him. "It was fair and honest, and I never got to give you my answer." Xavier's expression was carefully guarded, but hope flickered in his eyes. "And what is your answer, Maggie?" "That grief doesn't follow a timetable," she said softly. "That Thomas will always be part of me, but that doesn't mean there isn't room in my heart for someone else." She took a deep breath. "For you, Xavier." The guardedness fell away, replaced by a joy so pure it transformed his entire face. "Maggie, are you certain?" In answer, Maggie stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I'm certain that I want to find out where this path leads. With you." Xavier covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle yet firm. "That's all I ask. Time to see what might grow between us." From inside came the sound of counting down to midnight, as the shouts of "Happy New Year" erupted. Xavier leaned down and pressed his lips to Maggie's in a kiss that was tender and questioning at first, then deepening as she responded with unexpected fervor. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing quickly, their faces flushed despite the cold. "Happy New Year, Maggie Sullivan," Xavier whispered. "Happy New Year, Xavier Reed," she replied, her smile bright enough to rival the stars overhead. Winter gradually gave way to spring, bringing new life to the ranch and new depth to Maggie and Xavier's relationship. They took things slowly, respectful of Maggie's still healing heart and the watchful eyes of the ranch community. Evening walks, Sunday rides to the nearby creek, quiet conversations by the fire each moment together strengthened the bond between them. In March, Elizabeth Parker gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and Maggie found herself taking on additional responsibilities in the main house. Xavier, always observant, noticed her exhaustion and arranged for one of the younger ranch hand sisters to help in the kitchen. "You're working too hard," he told Maggie one evening as they walked along the creek, the first wildflowers beginning to dot the banks. "Elizabeth is worried about you, and so am I." Maggie squeezed his hand. "I'm fine, truly, just adjusting to the new routine." Xavier stopped walking and turned to face her. "Maggie, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." The seriousness in his tone made Maggie's heart skip. "What is it?" "Mr. Parker offered me a partnership in the ranch," Xavier said, his eyes searching hers. "A small share now with the opportunity to increase it over time." "Xavier, that's wonderful," Maggie exclaimed. "You've certainly earned it." "It would mean staying here permanently," Xavier continued, "building a future here." He paused, then added softly, "A future I hope might include you." Maggie's breath caught. "Are you asking?" Xavier took both her hands in his. "Not quite yet, but I am asking if that's a question you might be open to hearing in the near future." Joy bloomed in Maggie's chest, warm and expansive. "Yes, Xavier, that's a question I would very much like to hear." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He pulled her close, his kiss conveying everything words could not. April brought a letter from the bank that had foreclosed on Maggie's homestead. The property had been sold, and there was a small sum remaining after the debts were settled. Not much, but more than Maggie had expected. Xavier accompanied her to town to collect the money, a final closing of the chapter on her life with Thomas. As they drove past the turnoff that would have led to her former home, Maggie felt a momentary pang, not of regret but of gratitude for the life she had shared there. "Would you like to visit?" Xavier asked, noticing her gaze. "We have time." Maggie considered, then shook her head. "No. I carry the memories with me. The land belongs to someone else now." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes the best way to honor the past is to move forward with the lessons it taught us." In town, after concluding her business at the bank, Maggie used a small portion of the money to purchase a silver pocket watch for Xavier, having noticed his old one was unreliable. The inscription she requested was simple: "For all our tomorrows, M." She presented it to him that evening as they sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Xavier opened the small box, his expression softening as he read the inscription. "Maggie, it's perfect. Thank you." He hesitated, then said, "I have something for you as well, though this wasn't how I planned to give it to you." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. Tipping it into his palm, he revealed a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect emerald set in the center. "It was my mother's," Xavier explained, his voice thick with emotion. "My father gave it to her when he asked her to marry him. She always said it should go to the woman I loved." Maggie's eyes filled with tears as Xavier slid from the porch swing onto one knee before her. "Maggie Sullivan, I know we haven't known each other long in the counting of calendar pages, but my heart has recognized yours from the first moment I saw you beside that broken fence. You've brought light back into my life, and I can't imagine my future without you in it." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Through her tears, Maggie smiled. "Yes, Xavier. Yes, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, the emerald catching the last rays of the setting sun. They were married in May, beneath an arch of spring blossoms in the Parkers' garden. Elizabeth, recovered from childbirth and radiant in blue silk, stood as Maggie's witness, while Mr. Parker stood with Xavier. The ranch hands cleaned up impressively for the occasion, and the local preacher performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Maggie wore a new dress of cream-colored silk, her honey-brown hair adorned with wildflowers. As she walked toward Xavier, who waited for her with undisguised adoration in his eyes, she felt Thomas's presence one last time, not as a shadow over her happiness, but as a gentle benediction, a release into this new chapter of her life. "You look beautiful," Xavier whispered as she reached him. "So do you," she replied, taking in his tall figure in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his blue eyes shining with love. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier cupped Maggie's face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that several of the ranch hands cleared their throats awkwardly and looked away. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food, music, dancing, and more than a few emotional toasts. As the evening wore on, Xavier led Maggie away from the festivities toward a small cottage at the edge of the ranch property. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he said, lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Maggie gasped as she took in the interior of the cottage. It was simply but beautifully furnished, with polished wooden floors, comfortable chairs by the fireplace, and curtains that matched the ones she had once admired in a shop window in town. "When did you do all this?" she asked, turning in a circle to take it all in. Xavier smiled. "I've been working on it for months. The hands helped with the building and repairs. Elizabeth advised on the furnishings." He looked suddenly uncertain. "Do you like it?" Maggie threw her arms around his neck. "I love it. It's perfect." His arms encircled her waist, drawing her close. "You're perfect," he murmured against her hair. That night, as they lay tangled in the sheets of their marriage bed, Xavier traced the contours of Maggie's face with gentle fingers. "I never thought I'd find this again," he said softly. "After losing everyone, I'd resigned myself to a life alone." Maggie pressed a kiss to his palm. "And I thought my chance at happiness died with Thomas. We were both wrong." Xavier drew her closer. "Remarkably, wonderfully wrong." As summer bloomed across the Colorado territory, Maggie and Xavier settled into their life together. Xavier's duties as foreman and part owner kept him busy, while Maggie continued to oversee the cooking for the ranch, though with more help now that she had additional responsibilities as Xavier's wife. They established routines and traditions. Sunday afternoons spent riding together across the ranch lands, evenings reading aloud by the fire, quiet mornings sharing coffee before the day's work began. Each day brought new discoveries about one another, new reasons to be grateful for the unexpected gift of their love. In August, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, Henderson's cattle once again broke through a fence line on the Circle Pawtucket southern border. Xavier and several hands rode out to round up the strays and repair the damage, returning hours later drenched and mud-splattered but successful. As Maggie helped Xavier out of his sodden coat, she said, "Reminds me of how we met." Xavier smiled, pulling her close despite his wet clothes. "Best day of my life, finding you crying by that broken fence." "I wasn't crying," Maggie protested with a laugh. "I was contemplating my situation very emotionally." "You were crying," Xavier said, dropping a kiss on her nose. "And looking so beautiful and brave despite your tears that I knew right then I was in trouble." "Trouble?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "The very best kind," Xavier assured her, capturing her lips in a kiss that quickly made them both forget about broken fences and thunderstorms. Autumn came again, painting the landscape in gold and crimson. On the anniversary of the day Xavier had fixed Maggie's fence, he surprised her with a picnic by the creek, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. 1 year, Xavier said, raising his cup of cider in a toast. 1 year since I found the other half of my soul crying beside a broken fence. Maggie smiled, clinking her cup against his. And here I thought you were just being neighborly, fixing my fence like that. Oh, I was, Xavier replied with a grin. Completely selfless and noble. The fact that you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen had nothing to do with it. Maggie laughed, the sound carrying across the water like music. Such a gentleman. Xavier's expression grew serious. I have another surprise for you. Another? Maggie asked. The picnic was more than enough. Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document which he handed to Maggie. She opened it, her eyes widening as she read. This is a deed, she said, looking up at him in confusion. Xavier nodded. To your homestead. Or what was your homestead? I bought it back. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. How? When? I've been working on it for months, Xavier admitted. The new owner was willing to sell for the right price. Mr. Parker helped with the financing. But why? Maggie asked, tears filling her eyes. We have our home at the Circle P. Xavier took her hands in his. Because it was important to you. Because it holds memories of Thomas, and those memories are part of what made you the woman I love. He paused. We don't have to live there. We could rent it out or sell it again if that's what you want. But I thought you should have the choice. Maggie launched herself into his arms, nearly toppling them both into the creek. Thank you, she whispered against his neck, for understanding, for giving me back a piece of my past without fearing it would threaten our future. Xavier held her tightly. Our future is built on everything that came before, good and bad. I would never ask you to forget or pretend. As they walked back to their cottage that evening, hand in hand beneath a sky ablaze with stars, Maggie felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find again after Thomas's death. Life had taken unexpected turns, bringing heartbreak and joy in equal measure, leading her to this moment, this man, this love. What are you thinking? Xavier asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Maggie squeezed his hand. I'm thinking that sometimes a broken fence is just the beginning of something beautiful. Xavier smiled, pulling her close to his side as they walked toward home. In that case, I'm grateful for every broken fence in the territory. 5 years later, on a bright spring morning, Maggie stood beside a newly mended fence on the edge of what was now the Reed family ranch. Xavier had partnered with Mr. Parker to purchase Henderson's land when the man finally drank himself into financial ruin, combining it with Maggie's former homestead to create a modest but thriving cattle operation of their own. Mama, Papa says the new calf is ready for me to name. Their 4-year-old son, Thomas Xavier Reed, came running across the pasture, his dark hair so like his father's ruffled by the breeze. Does he now? Maggie laughed, catching the boy and swinging him into her arms. And what name have you chosen? Star, Thomas declared confidently. Because she has a white star on her forehead. A fine name, Maggie agreed, setting him back on his feet. From the direction of the barn came Xavier, carrying their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Margaret, on his shoulders. The little girl squealed with delight as her father pretended to gallop like a horse. There's my beautiful wife, Xavier called, his smile as warm and genuine as it had been on their wedding day. Maggie's heart swelled with love for her family, this second chance at happiness she had never expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. As Xavier reached them, he set Elizabeth down beside her brother and pulled Maggie into a gentle embrace. Happy? He asked softly, his blue eyes searching hers. Maggie stood on tiptoe to kiss him, a kiss filled with 5 years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, and above all, a love that had healed them both. Completely, she answered, and knew it to be the absolute truth. Behind them, the fence stood sturdy and whole, a simple structure that had once represented all Maggie had lost and now symbolized everything she had gained, a boundary not to keep things out but to protect what was most precious, a framework supporting the life and love that had flourished within it. Xavier took her hand, and together they walked back toward their home, their children racing ahead, their future stretching before them like the endless Colorado sky, vast, beautiful, and full of promise.